Tens of thousands of people in South Sudan are starting to see food aid arrive in the region where the United Nations has declared that a famine has taken hold. Many of those affected have been facing starvation after trying to escape the country's civil war by seeking refuge in the marshes of the Nile. Our Africa correspondent Alistair Leithhead has travelled to a rebel-held town in Unity State where people have been gathering to receive help.
They came in their thousands as word spread that help was on its way. Most were women and children, hungry, tired, and waiting under a burning sun. They'd fled into the marshlands of the Nile to escape the civil war which is destroying the world's youngest country. But now they're desperate, and despite the risks, have come out for help. Well, this is the heart of the area that has been declared in famine. Thousands of people have gathered in this central area to be registered to receive food aid. They've come from the marshes and the swamps where they've been hiding from the fighting and where there's no food. And there are thousands more people who can't even reach here, and they desperately need help. Each card entitles them to a month of food rations, which will be airdropped in over the next few days. Everyone tells a similar story of hunger on the islands, surviving off wild honey and water lilies. People are dying of starvation, she said. That's why we're here, lining up for help. And she talked about how hard the war has been, particularly for old women who can't run to the river fast enough when the fighting comes. People loot their possessions, stealing cattle and goats, she said. This is what's left of a Médecins Sans Frontières clinic, destroyed when government troops briefly took the town in November. And this was the market, now back in rebel hands. Leer is the rebel leader's birthplace, which is why many suspect it's being targeted so harshly. The government militia kill and abduct people, he said. They raid and steal cows. They've burned houses and the church. The UN needs both sides to agree to a ceasefire before they can bring aid into contested areas. That lack of access has contributed to the famine.
So what we've had is for many, many months, humanitarian agencies have not been able to make it into this area. This is the first time that we're doing so, and so it's a real issue. What we need people to understand is that without safety, without assurance for security for the people that are in need and for the aid workers, we'll be having a catastrophic situation down the line.
Malnutrition is manageable here, despite the famine, but it's the places the help can't reach where hunger is taking lives. Alistair Leithhead, BBC News, in Thonyor, South Sudan.
Hello, very good evening to you. The world's facing its largest humanitarian crisis since 1945. That's the assessment of the United Nations, which says more than 20 million people face the threat of starvation and famine in 4 countries in Africa and the Middle East. £3.5 billion are said to be needed by July to avert disaster. This report from our World Affairs correspondent Richard Gulpin does contain images you may find distressing.
For months now, it's been known that millions of people, including young babies like Judah Jabba in Yemen, have been starving. She was just 4 months old when a BBC team met her in December. Across Yemen, hundreds of thousands more children have so little to eat they are struggling to stay alive. And the threat of mass starvation is affecting 3 other countries. This is a refugee camp in South Sudan, which, like Yemen, has been torn apart by conflict. Families forced to flee their homes and left with little to eat. Already a famine has been officially declared here, with almost half the population in urgent need of help.
We stand at a critical point in our history. Already at the beginning of the year, we are facing the largest humanitarian crisis since the creation of the United Nations. Now, more than 20 million people across 4 countries face starvation and famine. Without collective and coordinated global efforts, people will simply starve to death.
Of the huge number of people the UN says are now in danger, almost 2 million are in Nigeria. Nearly 5 million in South Sudan, nearly 3 million in Somalia, and more than 14 million in Yemen. The UN is predicting that without serious help, 1.4 million people could die before the end of the year, unless more aid money is found. They're calling for £3.6 billion to tackle this crisis. Aid agencies on the ground say at the moment they do not have enough money to deal with the rising demand for help.
A child who suffers from severe acute malnutrition, unless they are treated, there is a high likelihood that they will die. If they are treated, then they can recover completely. And the cost of that treatment can be as little as $80.
Apart from conflict, another major cause of the crisis is drought. This is Somalia, which has been particularly hard hit. In this hospital in the capital Mogadishu, doctors have been treating people who've travelled almost 200 miles to get medical help.
The most cases, the death cause is the dehydration. We are doing the rehydration of the child, and we're given also some antibiotics for that.
With the lives of so many children like these now at risk, the UN believes the global response must be quick. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Now, this weekend, the United Nations has warned of a looming humanitarian crisis with 20 million people facing famine. Its experts say that without urgent help, many will simply starve. There's growing concern about 4 countries in particular: Nigeria, South Sudan, Yemen and Somalia. And our correspondents in the region have been to some of the affected areas. We begin with Andrew Harding in Somalia.
The southern town of Baidoa is at the heart of Somalia's struggle against famine. Thousands of families are on the move here. These people arrived this morning looking for food, looking for water. Now, half the population of this country is in need of aid at the moment. Drought is the main problem, but so is conflict. In the countryside around here, for instance, Al-Shabaab, the militant Islamist group, is still in control. Aid agencies say they desperately need more funds. They only have a fraction of what they need and what they've been promised. And of course, remember, this is just one of 4 countries currently threatened by famine.
Famine has already been declared in parts of South Sudan, but this is a man-made crisis, and those fleeing war come here to northern Uganda. Around 2,000 people cross the border daily. This has become Africa's biggest refugee crisis and the world's 3rd largest after Afghanistan and Syria. People can no longer stay in their villages and towns because of fighting between the government and rebels. Those who come here bring with them harrowing tales of violence and a desperation to avoid starvation. But it's not just East Africa that is struggling with drought and hunger.
Here in Nigeria, in West Africa, mass hunger has been fueled by the brutal 7-year insurgency of the Islamist group Boko Haram. In the northeast of the country, where so many people have had to flee their homes because of the fighting, it's estimated 8.5 million people are in need of food aid, and 75,000 children are at risk of dying in the coming months. All this week on BBC News, we'll be taking a look at the hunger crisis of 4 badly affected countries and asking what can be done to help 20 million people facing famine.
My colleague Clive Myrie there.
Good evening. Tens of thousands of children are at risk of starving to death in parts of Africa and the Middle East as millions of people face the threat of famine. The United Nations says the crisis in the 4 affected countries, Nigeria, South Sudan, Somalia and Yemen, is the worst since the Second World War. Our first report tonight is from Nigeria, where the situation in the northeast of the country has been made even more challenging by a regional conflict. The BBC's Clive Myrie is in Maiduguri and sent this report. It does contain some flashing images.
They begin queuing at sunrise. You can't afford not to get in. And through the day, the stream of anxious women and their children gets bigger and bigger. Is my child malnourished? Could my child die? This treatment feeding centre has been working flat out recently, and in the queue we found Fana Ali and little Hadizam, just 10 months old, born into a cruel world.
We have had to beg for food, sometimes going to sleep without eating. Our home was burnt down and we had to leave our village, but I pray now that things will get better.
Fana's story is so typical. All these people were driven from their homes by the Islamist group Boko Haram, whose fighters for 7 years burned villages, killed thousands, and left 2.5 million people homeless, all in the name of strict Sharia law. Farmers couldn't tend their fields because of the fighting, and so now people starve. A nurse takes Hadizam's measurements. It's not good.
That's clearly in the red.
Yeah. She's painfully thin, and her weight is confirmation.
So does that mean the child is malnourished?
Yeah, it's malnourished.
But her chances of survival are better than Mohammed's, who's 4 years old, severely malnourished and badly weakened by TB. Or Bintu, aged 5, whose mother sits helpless nearby.
Seeing my daughter laying sick like this has been unbearable. There was little food around when we escaped Boko Haram. I can't count the number of days we have had to go hungry. It's been so difficult. I just want my child to live.
Seconds later, there's a new arrival at the treatment centre. Doctors struggle to help Mustafa, who's 20 months old, to breathe. Cradled in his mother's arms, his life is ebbing away. We met Mustafa yesterday. Last night, he died.
But what about those children who don't make it to a treatment centre like this, from areas inaccessible to aid, where there are no doctors or clinics, where food and water has been looted by retreating Boko Haram fighters? For those children, the end is inevitable. Innocent victims of a man-made tragedy.
And with aid stocks running low, the call for more international help is loud and clear.
Without more humanitarian aid in terms of food, we don't expect the situation to get better.
In fact, it could get worse.
If we don't get more help.
10-month-old Hadizam should make it. She has an appetite and can begin to recover. But while the Islamists of Boko Haram have been driven from most areas of the country, their legacy of pain and starvation endures. Clive Myrie, BBC News in northern Nigeria.
Well, like Nigeria, Yemen is experiencing a humanitarian crisis caused by conflict. In 2015, a Saudi-led coalition began bombing rebel forces after they had ousted the country's president. And today, 14 million people are said to be facing food shortages. That's according to the United Nations. The BBC has learned that the naval blockade imposed by the Saudis is preventing the delivery of cranes, for example, for offloading supplies at the country's biggest port. As our correspondent Nawal Al-Maghafi reports, one of the most important aid routes is virtually shut off.
Frail and severely malnourished, 5-month-old Nuruddin is struggling to stay alive. She's one of 2 million children in Yemen who have been left starving. Her father can barely cope. A civil servant, he hasn't been paid since the central bank closed down 6 months ago.
We took her to the clinic in our village a month ago, but they didn't get the milk she needed. I couldn't afford to bring her until now. She probably won't make it. She is too weak.
For people like Abdullah, even getting to this hospital may not be enough. There are barely any medical supplies, and fuel for the electricity generators is also scarce. Half of Yemen's hospitals have now been forced to close. The heart of the problem lies here, in what was once Yemen's busiest port. All 5 cranes used to offload vital food and fuel were bombed by the Saudi-led coalition in August 2015. The Saudis say that these cranes could be used to offload arms for the Houthi rebels and their allies. The World Food Programme has bought new cranes for Hodeida's port, but we've been told that the Saudi-led coalition has refused to allow them in. Yemen relies on imports for 90% of its staple foods. With the port disabled, barely anything is getting through. When I reported from here last summer, hospital wards were already full with children suffering from malnutrition. Among them was 8-year-old Salim. Severely malnourished, his immune system had collapsed. This is Salim now. Although he's out of danger, his long-term health will be affected. He's still unable to walk. Local doctors also took me to meet 6-month-old Fatima. Since I left, the bombing in Hodeida has intensified. Her mother was unable to get her to hospital. Fatima died last month.
And Nawal is with me now. You know this region very well, Nawal. I'm wondering, you'd agree that Yemen is the most acute example of this crisis. In your view, what will it take for the international community to make a really decisive intervention here?
I mean, like you said about both Nigeria and Yemen, both of them are man-made humanitarian crises. Yemen as an example, the conflict has been going on now for nearly 2 years. The Saudis say that that they intervened because they need to reinstate the legitimate government. But if you look at the ground, neither side has actually made any significant military advances. But the one thing that is moving quickly, or should I say, that's deteriorating quickly, is the humanitarian situation. There have been 3 rounds of UN-brokered peace talks, and all 3 of them failed. And it's because the international community hasn't put enough pressure on both warring factions to reach a peaceful resolution. Both, the international community has said time and time again that it's impossible for either side to succeed in a complete military victory. But they're not putting enough pressure on them. And they're definitely not putting enough pressure on the warring factions to respect and allow the distribution of aid. Because if there's anything we've learned, especially from 8-year-old Salim, is that if something isn't done soon to resolve this, not only will we be seeing a man-made man-made famine, but it's also something that's very, very difficult to recover from.
Nawal, again, thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Nawal Al-Magafi there for us. The United Nations is warning that 1.5 million people are on the brink of famine in South Sudan, with half the country facing severe food shortages. Armed conflict is fueling the crisis. Many people are unable to grow food, and dozens of aid workers have been kidnapped and murdered in recent months. After years of civil war, a peace deal was signed 3 years ago between South Sudan's government and rebel fighters, but it's been largely ignored by both sides. From Juba, our chief Africa correspondent, Anne Soy, sent this report.
A troubled beginning for the world's youngest nation. Tens of thousands have been killed. 1 in 3 here is displaced. And now they face the threat of famine. The youngest suffer most. This is the face of starvation. Christine Jackson weighs half as much as she should at almost 2 years. She's now on life-saving treatment, but her father worries that he won't be able to feed her well when they get discharged.
When you just live like this, no one can even help you here in South Sudan.
Jackson should be one of the better-off South Sudanese. He has a full-time job and a farm, but 4 years of civil war and high inflation have left him destitute. And there are many families like his. The doctor in charge here tells me this ward is always busy. So roughly how many children do you see in a month?
In a month we receive around 80 to 100 cases.
Right, and that is just in the capital, Juba. This is a hospital that takes care of children from outside the capital, and this ward really is the one that takes care of the severely malnourished children. In Juba, 1 in 10 children has been found to be severely malnourished, but then the statistics are higher outside the capital, where life is way more difficult. It is a harsh terrain. Insecurity has resulted in the death of more aid workers than anywhere else in the world. They are forced to use air transport, particularly in rebel-controlled areas like Ganyel.
We are not heading in with much food, and the violence has meant that many of the farmers have fled their farms, and this will occur through July when the next harvest begins to come in. So this is a crucial time in South Sudan. This is when we have to save the lives of the children.
After decades of civil war, South Sudan gained independence from its northern neighbor, but its troubles were far from over. Fighting broke out between supporters of President Salva Kiir and the now exiled former Vice President Riek Machar. A number of ceasefire deals have been struck and broken, sometimes in a matter of hours. There was a peace process midwife
and that peace process
the regional
was violated by them.
It was violated as soon
It
as
was violated.
it was signed.
It was violated by the rebels.
And both the rebels and government
No,
were blamed.
because the rebels find themselves like a spoiled child and they can just do anything they want.
With no end in sight to the fighting, these people are at the mercy of donors. And the youngest generation here suffers most. Ann Soy, BBC News, Juba.
Somalia's drought has claimed more victims, with 6 million people, that's half the country's population, now in need of assistance. Aid agencies are continuing to warn that the situation there is critical. However, even if famine is averted, for many families, the current drought has already had a devastating impact, as Andrew Harding reports from Puntland in northern Somalia.
This is nomad country. We're deep in northern Somalia, where roads are as rare as rivers, and every drought is a test to be stoically endured. But not this one. We find 1,000 nomadic families gathered in the stifling heat outside Hafo, a skeleton of a town. They've travelled miles in search of help. Guns everywhere, of course. Clan wars, pirates, militants. Trouble is always simmering here. But this drought is something out of the ordinary. The women beg the mayor for food. They say they've never lived through anything like it before. He tells them to be patient. There's not much in town except for a well. The nomads have set up camp here. Abdi Wali and his wife Hawa are accomplished builders. A few sticks and rags.
5 of you sleep here every night. It's quite a squeeze.
You might assume they're used to this sort of poverty. Then a mobile phone appears from Hawa's pocket. It's a useful reminder that these aren't poor people at all. They're middle-class nomads. And what they're experiencing today is what we'd recognise as a banking crash. And here's the bank. Outside town, like rock paintings, the nomads' dead livestock. Across Somalia, the drought has already killed millions of goats. Hawa's family had 100, the equivalent of almost £10,000 in savings. We were wealthy before this, she says. Now we're destitute. We eat rice once a day. Some of the sickest children have been taken to a clinic in town. But Abdi Wali and Hawa's youngest child never made it this far. Abdi Wali and 5-year-old Yahya show us the unmarked grave of 9-month-old Abul Qadir. He died last week. If this drought continues, I fear my other children will die too, he says. We have only 2 goats left. It's not enough. I will have to beg now. Our life as nomads is over.
For now, of course, the priority is to save lives and to drag Somalia away from famine. But beyond that, with the climate changing and the droughts here getting tougher, it's tempting to wonder whether the days of the nomad are numbered.
Sunset and the wind picks up, but still no rain. Andrew Harding, BBC News in northern Somalia.